are engaging in this kind of corruption, which is just not true. We work with the police every day, and there are so many fine police officers who are doing the job as it's meant to be and handling the trust that we've placed on them. So our recommendation, based on these circumstances, is that the defendant on indictment number 1, the assault and battery, be sentenced to 2.5 years in the House of Correction, and that being concurrent with indictment number 3. On the civil rights violation, that the defendant would be placed on 1 year of supervised probation to run from and after his committed sentence on count 3. And on intimidation of witness, misleading the police, that the defendant would be sentenced to not less than 4 years, no more than 5 years in the state prison. And then on count 4, false police reports by a public official, 1 year committed to the House of Correction, concurrent with count 3. And I would say, Your Honor, there's been a number of letters that have been provided in support of the defendant. And I find irony in, of course, people are going to support family members, but irony in the sense that many people talk about his caring nature and how he loves dogs and cared for dogs, and the manner in which Mr. LaFrance was treated that night. You wouldn't treat a dog that way. And he was a human being, he was a citizen, and I find it really despicable that he could have been treated in such a way while handcuffed and sucker punched, and then even worse, when placed in a cruiser on the belly where he couldn't move and he had been injured, that the defendant at that time would go around, open the door, and while he was totally helpless, punch him in the face. And then as he took him to the station, making statements about it's going to be worse for him. And then to find himself battered, injured, the next day facing these counts, but for the grace of God that there was that video that was working that night, and he knew about it because he had some connection to the landlord, we wouldn't be here. This would have gone unprosecuted, and Mr. LaFrance would have been the one who was prosecuted and would have faced the music the same way the defendant is today. So that is our recommendation. I'd ask the court to hear from Mr. LaFrance.
Certainly.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning, Mr. LaFrance.
Go ahead.
Please.
This event had a great impact on me. The defendant hurt me physically and mentally. I still feel the effects of it this day. This was uncalled for. I feel nervous around police. I was afraid to come forward. I was scared for my well-being. I was scared that they would come back. I still feel like that. I have PTSD. The incident I have to take medication. I am afraid to leave my house, that I might be reprimanded by the police again. I was scared for this. I didn't think anyone would believe me over the police. I would like to see the same happen to him that would have happened to me with the charges he put against me. I think a fair sentence would be to serve 5 years and 5 years parole. Thank you, Your Honor. David LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. LaFrance. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts on this subject.
Your Honor, the Court's permission, may I stand at the podium? Thank you. Your Honor, obviously this is a somber day, I would call it. It's a moment that is difficult for, certainly most importantly, Mr. Pessoa. He's got a whole gallery of people in support of him, and most, if not all, of family members or close dear friends of his. And I think they're deeply affected by what's going on and what's about to happen. It's also a sobering moment, and it's a bit of a disheartening moment for me as well, because as the Court's aware, based upon my submission, I formed a personal relationship with Mr. Pessoa, and that's essentially what I want to address the Court on. And with the Court's permission, I want to do that, and then I'm going to defer to Attorney Blythe to talk about the defense recommendation for sentence, And then you will also hear from Officer Michael Sylvia of the Fall River Police Department. And lastly, but most importantly, the court is going to hear from Mr. Pessoa.
Okay, thank you.
I met Mr. Pessoa based upon my representation of him at the outset. I came into the courtroom, I think it was courtroom 8 at the time, and I was retained to represent him. I knew little to nothing about the case, and I knew nothing about Mr. Pessoa at all. My first interaction with him was in lockup, and my disappointment with this case essentially started with the way in which Mr. Pessoa was prosecuted by this county. He was a police officer for 19 years. There was an investigation and there were indictments, but he was placed in custody. And there was a request for bail, despite his lack of criminal record, his ties with the community, and all the good that he did for the Fall River Police Department in his career. And this won't define Mr. Pessoa. And it may have been a bad choice that Mr. Pessoa made that day in February 2019. But when I had interacted with him in court and we left, we had a very brief conversation. And shortly thereafter, he came to my office. And when we met for the first time, I immediately saw Mr. Pessoa for the person that he is and who he stands before the court to be, which is an honorable guy and an intelligent guy. And we had a conversation, and it struck me how different he was from, quite frankly, most of the clients that I've represented in my 25 years. I understood where Mr. Pessoa was coming from. I believed in his case. I'm disappointed in the verdict, but I still believe in Mr. Pessoa's case. But we respect the verdict of the jury, and certainly respect what this court will dispense as it pertains to sentencing. The more that I interacted with Mr. Pessoa, Your Honor, I found that my initial reaction to him was accurate. He was somebody that was loyal. He was somebody who has high character. And at the time, simultaneous to my law practice, I was opening a restaurant with Attorney Blythe, and we were doing our best to acquire people to work at that restaurant. And given Mr. Pessoa's unemployment at the time, and given my fondness of him, I thought it would be a good idea to offer him a job. Mr. Pessoa came in thinking that we were going to talk about his case, but we didn't. We talked about the other business venture that we had, and how I thought Mr. Pessoa would have an opportunity working for me. And Mr. Pessoa was humble, he was appreciative, he accepted. But what was most telling to me as to who Mr. Pessoa was and continues to be is that Mr. Pessoa thereafter sent me a lengthy email, a well thought out, thorough email, explaining his stellar educational background, which the court is aware that he graduated cum laude with a college degree, and that he thought he could be better utilized in a managerial position at the restaurant. I paused, quite frankly, because though I was a new restaurateur, Mr. Pessoa had no experience in the business, and being a police officer, I didn't know, quite frankly, how that would translate. But again, given my fondness of him and my thought that Mr. Pessoa would be able to adapt and work hard, based upon what I learned from not only him, but other people in his family who I came to know, the opportunity was awarded him, and he took full advantage of it. That summer, which would have been the summer of 2021, Mr. Pessoa every day came to that restaurant and assisted all of us in trying to get that restaurant up and running. Painting, construction, carrying, cleaning, anything asked of Mr. Pessoa, he did. That reflected well on Mr. Pessoa then and continues to do so today. And Mr. Pessoa, with all of that, has a family similar to that. I've had the opportunity to interact with his parents who are here today, who are devastated, as the court I'm sure knows, but they are absolutely lovely people. His fiancée and her family, I can't say enough about them. I've spent hundreds of hours with Mr. Pessoa in a professional and a personal capacity. I've spent many hours with his immediate family, all of whom I may add parenthetically, were so loyal to Mr. Pessoa that they would come to the restaurant and lend their assistance. That's just the people that he was brought up with, he chose to be with as it pertains to his fiancée, and the person Mr. Pessoa is. I say that just as a glance into who Mr. Pessoa is. I've appeared before this court for years defending people. I've never had the role that I have today, which is to defend him, but also to give the court a personal side of a client, because it's never been my practice to do that. But I think the court knows counsel enough that given my choice to befriend Mr. Pessoa means something. The biggest responsibility this court has when it's bestowed the honor of being a judge in whether state or federal court is what is about to occur today, which is the sentencing and the liberty lost of an individual. And I don't think there's any greater power the court has. The court obviously has to show humility when it does that. It has to take into consideration what's just under the circumstances, what's reasonable under the circumstances, based upon not only the actions and the convictions for which the jury returned guilty verdicts on, but also Mr. Pessoa's personal character, Mr. Pessoa's lack of criminal record, the family and friends that are here in support of Mr. Pessoa, and certainly taking into consideration what sentencing needs to do. And Attorney Blake will touch on that. I will just ask the court to consider all that, which I'm confident that it will when it dispenses an appropriate sentence for Mr. Pessoa. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Kimball.
Your Honor, in my 12 years as a criminal...
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Kimball. Ms. Blank.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, in my 12 years as a criminal defense attorney, I often find that addressing the court on sentencing, whether it be in order to advocate for a client for a plea or after a trial, is the most difficult of my jobs. And that's because the court is often looking at a person and looking at their worst moment and not their best. And a person has a whole lifetime of experiences that leads to that moment for which the court dispenses punishment. And I think in this case, rather than, and more so than in other cases that I have advocated for clients on, that's extremely apparent. We can't forget what Mr. Pessoa has done in his life. And this one moment doesn't define who Mr. Pessoa is, who he is going to be, or even all of who he was. You've had an opportunity to read numerous character reference letters from family members, friends, fellow officers, a principal that saw Mr. Pessoa in high school, all of whom describe who Mr. Pessoa is as a person. And they use words like integrity, selfless, humble. And they describe situations in Mr. Pessoa helping those who are less fortunate and had been less fortunate than Mr. Pessoa. Going out and buying Christmas gifts, helping with turkey drives, things that his job did not necessitate him to do. But that's who Mr. Pessoa is. And that's who Mr. Pessoa will continue to be. And that's who his family is. And that's who they will continue to be. The court is aware of the sentencing guideline ranges in this case, and aware that in Massachusetts, unlike in other systems like the federal systems, they're advisory. And as spelled out in the sentencing memorandum that we presented to the court, Mr. Pessoa falls in a discretionary zone of the sentencing guidelines, which allows Your Honor to impose any sentence that Your Honor feels is reasonable, not more than necessary, in order to punish Mr. Pessoa for the actions of February 12, 2019, and to meet all the other purposes of sentencing: general deterrence, specific deterrence, rehabilitation, retribution, can all be considered in determining the appropriate sentence. In any event, the sentencing guidelines call for a range of 1 to 3 years incarceration should Your Honor feel that incarceration be necessary. It's the defendant's position and the defense's position that Mr. Pessoa has suffered a tremendous loss already. He has lost his identity as a police officer because of this conviction, an identity that he will never get back. He worked for 18 and a half years as a police officer earning a pension. That pension has been lost. You've read in his character reference letters how much those things meant to him. And not the monetary things, Your Honor, that's second to Mr. Pessoa. But that idea of helping people is really what brought Mr. Pessoa into the line of duty. And that remains important to him. And I've seen it personally over the course of the 2 years that I've known Mr. Pessoa personally. He's the first person to lend a helping hand, the first person to ask if you're okay, the first person to offer help. And that was what was referenced over and over and over again in his character reference letters. I'd suggest to Your Honor that certainly this case is serious. The impact on society is great. There has been a lot of press in this case, all of which puts a whole different spin on this criminal case than most criminal cases. But at the end of the day, what stands before Your Honor is a man, Mr. Pessoa. And your sentence is going to greatly impact not only him, but all of the people sitting in that audience, his fiancé, his parents, his younger brother, his nieces, all of the adopted children, nieces and nephews and friends, godchildren that have been written about in those character references. No matter the sentence, the impact will be great. And the impact should be great, Your Honor, because they're serious cases, serious convictions. The defense understands that. The defense also understands that Mr. Pessoa is going to go into a system which is going to treat him differently because of his role as a former police officer. And that can't be taken lightly either. And when Your Honor is fashioning a sentence, part of the reason for the request of a house arrest instead of some incarcerated time for Mr. Pessoa is exactly the safety issues that Mr. Pessoa may face if incarcerated in any capacity. Certainly the concern is greater in the state prison system, where the people who have been sentenced there necessarily have either committed more serious acts or have a more serious record, have a greater disregard for our criminal laws, and are more likely to put Mr. Pessoa in danger. Mr. Pessoa deserves to be sentenced like any other criminal defendant. He deserves to be sentenced justly and not more than necessary to fit the crime. Should Your Honor consider a sentence of incarceration, we pray that you do so to the House of Correction, where Mr. Pessoa will be safer, dealing with lower-level offenders around him, and less in fear for his personal safety. However, the defense suggests to the court that a period of house arrest in which he cannot leave his home, he is on a 24/7-hour lockdown, with a period of probation from and after that could step down after that, is an appropriate sentence when considering the fact that, quite frankly, there's no specific deterrence in this case, Your Honor. Mr. Pessoa will never be a police officer again. He'll never be in a position to use excessive use of force again. In terms of general deterrence, you see officers sitting in the courtroom, you see men sitting in the courtroom throughout the course of the trial. I think the message has been sent that their actions are under fire. They're going to be watched. And if they step out of line, there are going to be significant and serious consequences, to include criminal prosecution, loss of pensions, loss of jobs, and loss of their identity as well. With all that being said, Your Honor, we pray that you sentence him according to our recommendation of 3 years of probation, 1 year of house arrest, 2 years following whatever conditions Your Honor sees fit.
May I approach the podium, Your Honor?
Or you want me right here?
That's fine.
I've been a police officer 26 years. I met Mike Pessoa when he came over for my watch, and we got along pretty well. I worked at Coxwell, he worked at Car 8. And we have done and saved lives all the time. Mike was always there. He was always ready to help. The amount of CPR we have done, the fires we have run into probably when we shouldn't have, to save somebody's life. My wife and I hadn't taken a honeymoon, so Mike offered to watch our dog. And he's a big dog, he's a Shepherd Akita. Nobody wanted to watch him. And Mike took me to his house, and he asked me, hey, it's all right if I go out for a little while and leave Harley there? I said, yeah, it should be. Mike came back, and all I got was a picture of his bed, ripped apart. He didn't get mad. He left it that way till I got it, and I was able to see it.
He also, at the same time, he was watching my dog. My dog alerted to something outside his house, and it was a fatality. A gentleman got hit crossing the street, and Mike stayed with him until he took his last breath. He didn't leave him. He wasn't alone. Mike is kind-hearted. He loves his job. Everything he does is for a purpose. I've seen Mike not hesitate sometimes when dealing with alcohol-related incidents. And there was a time when we were at Almax, and Mike didn't react first, and he ended up getting his head split open. So when you hear blue blood, it's when one of us bleeds, we all bleed. So I've been all to funerals. Officer Gagny he hesitated. He was hit with a rock and killed. We knew that. We're trained to react. But in all my time, I couldn't say I had never worked with a better police officer than Mike. He's helped everyone, children, homeless. His heart is great. In closing, Your Honor, you have the toughest job, whether to send him to prison, and he's got to deal with that, or be lenient and let him live his life over one incident. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Sawyer. I'd also like to know that I read the letter that you submitted as well.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So there are two making statements to the court.
Mr. Pessoa.
You hear, Your Honor?
Whoever's most comfortable with you.
Your Honor, I'd just like to let the court know that I'll be reading from a handwritten statement that I wrote just a few days ago. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the court for giving me an opportunity to speak here today. The last 4+ years have been an extremely testing and difficult time for me, as well as for my family and friends, especially my fiance. I've always prided myself on being a law-abiding, productive member of society. Unfortunately, a series of events on the night of February 12, 2019 forever changed and affected many lives. Just over 3 weeks ago, on May 31st, right here in this very courtroom, I was convicted and realized I must face and deal with the consequences. With that being said, also dealing with these consequences are my family members, especially my fiance, our 3 dogs, whom I love very much, and have never spent a day of their lives without me. So, over the last 3+ weeks, while incarcerated, I've had nothing but time to think and reflect on this entire situation. During this time, I've gained a new perspective on what it means and feels like to be incarcerated. I have no shame in standing here today and openly admitting that I now have a different light on what incarceration means. And I truly believe if this different perspective existed sooner, I would have been a different person with many different views. It truly has been an eye-opening and humbling experience. I've always been a good person, someone with a big heart and good intentions. I was raised by loving parents who always emphasized the importance of education, hard work, integrity, respecting authority, and obeying the law, which is a way I've tried to live my 44 years. In closing, I'm asking Your Honor to please be fair and reasonable in her sentencing. And while I've already lost so much and suffered over the last 4+ years, I understand and respect that I must deal with the decision of this court. I love my fiance, I love my dogs, I love my friends, and I love my family very much. And I just hope I can be with them again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pessoa. In every case, there are many factors the court considers in sentencing. In this case, as in every other case, I start. The jury's convicted Mr. Pessoa of assaulting and beating David LaFrance and violating his civil rights while doing so. Mr. Pessoa then filed a false police report and lied to his superior officers about his misconduct. Clearly, as acknowledged by all in this courtroom, they are very, very serious offenses. I've also considered the sentencing guidelines, as consistency in sentences is an important measure of justice. I've also considered the impact statement of Mr. LaFrance, just given earlier today. Mr. LaFrance, regardless of his conduct that night, did not deserve to be beaten and bloodied by a man who took an oath to serve and protect him. I considered that Mr. Pessoa has no criminal record. I additionally have read the Commonwealth's and the defendant's memoranda, and I've listened very carefully to all of the sentencing arguments made here this morning. I've also considered Mr. Pessoa's heartfelt impact statement to the board. I have read all of the commendations provided by defense counsel that were received by the defendant during his tenure at the Fall River Police Department, which describe many, many circumstances where Mr. Pessoa served the public with distinction and honor, including an event which involved a volatile situation with an individual threatening to rob a home, another event where Mr. Pessoa subdued an armed man, and yet another event where Mr. Pessoa ran into a burning home to save an 86-year-old woman. I've also read the 14 letters that were sent to the court on the defendant's behalf, which shed light on the defendant's personal and home life. What my review of all of the materials submitted in this case clearly demonstrates is that Mr. Pessoa, like most human beings, is not a one-dimensional figure. It's difficult, if not impossible, to square the Michael Pessoa on the videotape assaulting and beating a defenseless David LaFrance with the Michael Pessoa who rushed into a burning building to save an elderly woman, the Michael Pessoa who's adored his son, brother, uncle, and cousin who organizes basketball clinics for city youth and participates in charitable Thanksgiving and Christmas drives for the needy. Impossible to square those two figures. Lastly, I have considered, and this is a factor that weighs heavily on the court, that in committing these crimes, Mr. Pessoa violated the public trust. There's no question whatsoever that the job of a police officer is a dangerous and difficult one. A job that deserves the community's admiration and respect. However, when police officers commit misconduct, particularly misconduct involving excessive force, it erodes the public trust and cuts to the core of the criminal justice system. Without public confidence in the police, the safety of the community and of fellow law enforcement officers is at risk. This has been a difficult case. It's a difficult sentencing task. I have fashioned a sentence which I believe and hope encompasses all of these factors in a just and fair manner. Ms. Riley?
Michael Pessoa, on indictment 1973 CR 182-7, charging you with intimidation of a witness, juror, police, or court official, the jury having found you guilty, and the court having considered the offense for which you now stand convicted. It is the order of this court that you be punished by confinement to the Massachusetts State Prison for not less than 1.5 years and not more than 3 years committed. On indictment 1973 CR 182-5, charging with assault and battery, the jury having found you guilty and the court having considered the offense for which you now stand convicted,
It is the order of this court that you be placed on probation for a period of 1 year from and after your incarceration on indictment number 7. On indictment 1973 CR 182-6, the jury having found you guilty to so much of this indictment that alleges civil rights violation, and the court having considered the offense for which you now stand convicted, it is the order of this court that you be placed on probation for 1 year from and after your incarceration on indictment 7. Said probation is to run concurrent with the probation imposed on indictment 5. On indictment 1973 CR 182-8, charging you with false report by a public employee, the jury having found you guilty of this offense and the court having considered the offense for which you now stand convicted, it is the order of this court that you be placed on probation for 1 year, again from and after your incarceration on indictment 7, and concurrent with your probation on indictments 5 and 6. You have the right to appeal the judgment of the court to the appeals court of the Commonwealth within 30 days. You also have a right to appeal the sentence to the appellate division of the Superior Court within 10 days. I must advise you that having been convicted of these offenses, it is now your obligation to comply with the provisions of General Laws, Chapter 22E, Section 3, the State DNA Database, by providing a sample of your DNA to the State DNA Database within 1 year of your conviction. The general conditions of probation that the court imposes include that you shall obey all local, state, and federal laws and all court orders, that you shall report to your assigned probation officer at such time and place as directed. You shall notify the probation officer immediately of a change of residence or employment. You shall not leave Massachusetts without the express permission of the probation service, and if permission is granted, you shall sign a waiver of extradition and rendition before traveling. If you are incarcerated, you shall report to the probation service within 48 hours after you are released from incarceration or on the next business day following a weekend or court holiday. You shall immediately inform the probation service of any new criminal charges against you. You shall allow the probation officer to visit you at home, school, or place of employment at any time with or without notice. You shall sign all releases necessary for supervision and verification of compliance with these conditions of probation. You shall not unlawfully receive, possess, control, or transport any drugs, weapons, explosives, firearms, or ammunition. You shall pay all court-ordered assessments and fees. In addition to those conditions, the court has imposed the following special conditions, which, as I just stated, is the requirement that you shall submit a DNA sample pursuant to General Laws, Chapter 22E, Section 3. Also, the court orders that you shall have no direct or indirect contact with David LaFrance. The court has also imposed a $90 victim witness fee and the statutory DNA assessment fee. If you violate any of the conditions of your probation while you're incarcerated and prior to the commencement of the term of your probation may be subject to revocation. I also must advise you that all fees and fines shall be paid by the end date of your probation. Failure to appear on that date or make payment by that date may result in your default and or incarceration. If payment of the fees and fines will cause a substantial hardship to you, your immediate family, or your dependents, you may petition the court for relief by filing an appropriate motion and affidavit. You will also be awarded time spent in confinement on this matter, which I think is 22 days, May 31st, until today. At this time, you stay in custody of the court officers and executioners.
That's why I think we do everything.
Counsel, what do we do with the other matters?
Maybe we could put it on for a second.